All right, thank you for watching this video here. This is a presentation that was given on March 27th, 2024 as a follow-up to a conversation we had with the community in June and July of 2023 on a proposed project with WashU and Concordia University. So today we're going to be talking about the overlay district and also the Big Bend traffic study that was recently performed. We talked about both of those in the summer of 2023, and we've been working diligently ever since to try to come up with a set of regulations for the proposed project. So I want to start by talking about the importance of community planning. And well-planned communities seek to do the following things. That's develop a collective vision through public dialogue, provide long-term continuity across time and successive elected bodies, balance community interests, protect public and private investment, ensure that land use patterns are orderly and rational, and establish a predictable set of regulations for all stakeholders. This community discussion, this video here, engageclayton.com, the community meetings we've held, and the neighborhood level meetings that are coming up, those are all intended to further these objectives. So before we get into the overlay districts that we'll talk about, and before we start talking about the traffic study that was performed, I do want to mention the Fontbonne University acquisition. So this has been well publicized, and I know everyone's aware that Washington University will be acquiring the Fontbonne campus. Fontbonne University will continue to operate on the campus until the end of the 2025 summer semester. At that point in time, Washington University will then occupy the campus in the same manner that Fontbonne currently is for the foreseeable future. If in the future, Washington University decides that they'd like to change the use or undertake some sort of long-term planning effort for that campus, then they'll engage the city and engage the public to have those particular discussions. But at this point in time, the simple acquisition of the Fontbonne campus doesn't impact either of the proposed overlay districts or the traffic assessment that was performed for Big Bend. So I just wanted to talk about that at the outset because we did receive quite a few questions about it at the public meeting. So I highlighted this back in the summer of 2023, and I think it's important to look at it again, which is the purpose of zoning, because zoning isn't the most intuitive thing. Zoning really seeks to regulate three separate things. The first is the use of land or buildings. So when we talk about use, we're talking about just that, how the land will be utilized. So is it going to be residential in nature, commercial, office, institutional? You could have a variety of uses, but zoning seeks to regulate what uses are appropriate for specific areas. Zoning also regulates the intensity of the land use. So for instance, if you say you have residential zoning, you could have varying intensity within that zoning district. When we talk about intensity, it's things like density. How much traffic is it going to create? How much activity is that use going to create? So for instance, within a residential district, a single-family residential district is a very low intensity use. Those are just individual homes on single lots. A multifamily development, on the other hand, is very intense because you have that increased density within the same amount of area. So zoning seeks to regulate intensity. And finally, the bulk of the use. And the bulk is the physical structures themselves on that piece of property. So how tall are the buildings? How much of the lot do they coverage? How close are they to the property lines? Zoning regulates the bulk of those uses. And so when we look at the current zoning for the area we're going to talk about in this presentation, you can see that the Washington University South 40 campus and the Concordia Seminary property are both in this darker yellow color here, and that's R2 single-family residential. And you'll notice that the surrounding neighborhoods also have that same zoning designation. So currently, we're regulating institutions using the same standards that we're using for single-family homes that are on much smaller lots. And the way that's accomplished is we employ what's called conditional uses. So conditional uses are uses that are considered to be desirable or permitted. However, we recognize that they could have some potential negative impacts. And so typically those are things, and this comes straight from our municipal code, like additional traffic volume, parking beyond their capacity, or other detrimental impacts. And the way you mitigate those potential impacts is by putting conditions on that approval. So for instance, if you have concerns about traffic, you could put conditions on there that address that particular concern. What happens over time, though, when you have these conditional use permits is what you see on the screen here. And the details around the edges aren't really important. But this is the Washington University South 40 campus. And so over time, as each building or areas within buildings were constructed or proposed, Washington University would apply for a conditional use permit. There would be public hearings held, and the community would try to come up with a set of conditions that would mitigate any potential negative impacts. And over time, you end up having just a stack of files for each one of these particular components. And each component has a different set of regulations. So this is very unpredictable, and it's very haphazard, and it's very difficult to interpret what the rules are because each building has a different set of rules. And because it's difficult to interpret, it's also difficult to enforce. And so what we're proposing is to put together, through the use of overlay districts, a very standardized system, a very clear black and white code, so to speak, that sets out all of the rules and regulations for development on the South 40 campus and then within the Big Bend overlay or Concordia West side of the property through the use of these specialized districts. So we currently have overlay districts within the city of Clayton, and this is how it's established in the municipal code. You can see here, overlay districts are specific areas of the city for which special regulations have been adopted to address specific subjects that require special treatment. And there are a number of different types of overlay districts that we see. It's important to know that the overlay district itself supersedes the regulations of the base zoning district. So if an overlay district were to go in place, it would essentially replace the single-family zoning that currently exists at those sites. There are advantages of doing the overlay. Again, we're trying to create the long-term, the box for long-term phase development, which leads to cohesive development over time. So again, laying out at the outset what the rules are, rather than being reactive and more haphazard with your planning. It provides predictability for the community, for the adjacent residents, and also for the developers. So as a resident, you don't have to play defense every time there's a conditional use application because you know what the rules are. The developer applies for a project or for a particular portion of a project. They know what the rules are at the outset. And so for the overlay district parameters, what we're seeking to do is preserve neighborhood character and the quality of life for nearby residents. And as we've gone through these public meetings, we've really heard three primary concerns. First of all, residents don't want to see it. And so there are ways to mitigate that. And that's by regulating the building heights, the depth of the transition zones, or the lighting on the site. Residents don't want to hear it. And so you can address that by putting in place decibel limits. Also through the setbacks, the distance that buildings are set back from a property line, and also those transition zones or buffer areas. And residents don't want traffic or parking in their neighborhoods. And we can regulate that by mandating proper access points and making sure that ample on-site parking is provided. And so to give you an overview of the project area, this is the existing plan. This is the existing map. And you can see here, the Washington University Danforth campus, which is actually outside of the city of Clayton. That's located in unincorporated St. Louis County, but it's just north of Forsyth here, bounded by Skinker, Forest Park Parkway on the north, and Big Bend Boulevard on the west. There's the Washington University South 40 campus, which is within the city of Clayton. It's at the corner essentially of Forsyth and Big Bend, with Wydown here to the south. And then further to the south, we have the Concordia Seminary property. We'll talk about that quite a bit. You can see Big Bend here, but their access is actually coming through the neighborhoods and off of Seminary Place. And finally, at the south end of this particular map, you can see the Washington University South 40 campus. That is the former CPC site where they have a number of recreational uses presently. And so the proposal that's in front of the city is to relocate the Concordia Seminary housing that's currently located along Big Bend to the interior portion of the site. And this is the plan that they've proposed. They laid this out in the meetings that were held in the summer of 2023. And what they're proposing to do is take 75 multifamily units that are currently located along Big Bend and move those to the interior portion of the site and replace them with 81 multifamily units. So they're going to go from 27 buildings along Big Bend to 5 buildings that are interior to the site with roughly the same number of units. Through this process, they'll also replace 75 single student dorms with 75 efficiency units. So not a big change in density, but just changing the location on the site for those particular units. And from a parking standpoint, there is a garage proposed that would be on the south side of this particular project area, just north of these residences on San Benita. And we would have 657 spaces there, and that's replacing 633 spaces that are located throughout their current residential area on the Concordia campus. Once the housing is moved to the interior of the Concordia site, Washington University would take the athletic uses that are located on South 40 and on the CBC site, and then move them to that area that was vacated by Concordia along Big Bend. So we're talking specifically about the baseball and softball fields that are up here in the northwest corner of the South 40, and also the intramural field and potentially gym or auditorium space that's at the CBC site. Those would all move to this particular area on the Concordia campus. Washington University would then take the vacated portion at the corner here and rework the housing within the South 40 over time. So this is a long process. The Concordia housing, I would imagine, would take at least 18 to 24 months to get that relocation done. Then there would be quite a bit of site work, and then Washington University would need to put those athletic uses on this site before they could address the South 40. So we're looking at years and years of phased development throughout the course of this project. But essentially, the institutions are trying to expand and reinvent themselves within the existing institutional footprints in the area. And so the existing flow for pedestrians and vehicles are depicted on this map here. This is the South 40 campus, and you can see there's bicycle circulation that's internal to their campus. For vehicles, they access off of Wallace Drive. There's also interior access and access to Big Bend over here. But you can see as you move south, there is no direct access currently to the Big Bend site off of Big Bend. So permitted uses. So we talked about the three different things that zoning seeks to regulate, which are uses, intensity, and bulk. And we're going to start with uses here. And this first slide, and this is really important to understand, these are the current uses that are permitted within that single-family residential district with the issuance of a conditional use permit. This is the way the city has been doing this for many decades. And you can see as a primary use, we currently allow as a permitted use, along with that permit to mitigate nuisances, colleges and universities, provided that buildings shall not occupy more than 1/3 of the area site. We also allow accessory uses, and you can see a very long definition here that says a subordinate building or use customarily incidental to and located on the same lot, occupied by the main building or use, subordinate in area, extent, or purposes to the main building, limited to and contributing to the comfort, convenience, or necessity of the occupants of the main building. That is a lot of words, and it is a very, very broad definition. Both of these are incredibly broad. Essentially, Washington University or any other institution can come to the city with any use they could think of, tie that to the university, as long as the university's running that particular use. It is essentially permitted. And the city has the ability to put some conditions, again, on that particular use. But this is more or less wide open to anything they may consider on their particular properties. And so what we would like to do is come up with a very specific list of uses that are permitted on the site and say that anything not on that list is prohibited. So this is straight from the overlay draft that the city has been working on. And you can see uses not expressly listed as approved primary or accessory uses shall be prohibited. So very, very strict wording there. If it's not on the list, it would not be allowed. That's very different than what we currently have. Again, where any use they can think of would be considered as a permitted use as long as we can issue the conditional use permit with some conditions on it to mitigate any potential nuisances. So again, wide open right now and trying to be very limiting in the future as to what they can do. All permitted uses shall be provided for students, faculty, and employees of the university or patrons visiting the site to support the university uses. or patrons associated with an event hosted on the property. So the permitted uses have to be used for university purposes. And the third bullet here is uses providing services to the general public outside of events or activities are essentially prohibited. So they couldn't build, say, a restaurant with a drive-through at the corner of Big Bend and Forsyth and open that up to the public and just say, hey, this is a university use, but essentially it's just acting as a restaurant that's open to anyone. So on the Big Bend overlay, we only have two proposed primary uses. First, athletic and recreational facilities. They could be indoor or outdoor, or playgrounds. So that's it. Extremely limiting. Again, right now under single family, they can apply for anything they want. We would have a restriction on the Big Bend overlay, and this is that athletic site, where all that can go in there are those athletic uses or playgrounds. So they couldn't come to us and say, we want to put a dorm there, or we'd like to put research facilities. That wouldn't be permitted on that particular site. It's expressly prohibited. And then there was a list of proposed accessory uses. So these are uses that support those recreational, the recreational primary use on the site. So you can see administrative and faculty offices related to athletics or recreation, events on the site, auditoriums. We could have band practice on the site, commencement, concessions, and you can see the list here, and we'll post the draft overlays as well, so you can look at this in more detail. But we do have a very specific list of proposed accessory uses. And then there's a provision number 15 on here that basically said any other accessory use or facility that is common to a private university and deemed to have similar or lesser impacts may be approved by the Plan Commission. So if something not on this list was proposed by Washington University and was intended to support one of these primary uses, then the Plan Commission could consider that and allow that use. For any events that would be held on the Big Bend overlay with an anticipated attendance of 3,000 people or more, that would require a special event permit. So they would have to apply with the city. They would have to tell us how they're going to handle the traffic, the parking, what the hours of that event would be, what that event entails, so that we're aware of that activity on the site. And then we do have a hard cap on there that events or activities could not exceed 5,000 attendees or participants. So that would be the absolute maximum that would be allowed. And so for the South 40, and this is the housing area, we have again a limited number of proposed primary uses here. Essentially, these uses are what you see currently on the site. So any use of the grounds or the buildings for the teaching of college or university classes, research facilities, operational facilities, or any function of a similar nature. We would allow dormitories and residence halls, providing housing for students, faculty, and staff, and then also detached multi-unit housing or multiple structures on a parcel for housing students, faculty, staff, visitors, or members of the college or university. So again, these are the uses we currently see on the South 40, and that's what we would anticipate in the future. And that's really all we would allow in the future as primary uses. For the accessory uses that support those primary functions, again, you can see the long list here of items, very similar to what's currently allowed on the South 40 and what we see there. So dining halls, libraries, bookstores, places of worship, recreation structures. Again, retail would be things like the bookstore over there. And so again, you can see this list, and number 18 is kind of that catch-all, just like we have on the Big Bend overlay, where it allows a little bit of flexibility for the university to propose accessory uses that are similar in nature to what's on the list, and that would go to support those primary functions on the site. Those could be considered by the city and would need to be approved by the Plan Commission. So on the South 40 overlay, we do want to address the housing density as well. This is something that isn't currently defined in our municipal code. And historically, what the city has done is addressed housing density every time a conditional use permit application was received. And so if you look at the current density on the site, not including the athletic fields, so subtracting out the area with the baseball fields and the softball fields on the corner, If you take the number of beds that are currently there and divide it by the area on the site, you come up with 94 beds per acre. And so what we're proposing for the South 40 is to keep that density of 94 beds per acre, but just add in the additional land that's there where the athletic fields currently exist. So this will result in an overall higher number of beds, but by keeping the density the same, we should anticipate that the buildings that would be built in that particular spot would be of the same size and scale of the buildings that currently exist on the South 40. Turn it over to Anna Crane, our Director of Planning and Development Services, to go over the site design standards.
Okay, so David covered going into regulating the site in terms of the use and then touched on the intensity. Now we're going to look at how to physically regulate development on the site. Lot coverage is something in our existing code that we use to influence how a lot is covered in terms of impervious coverage, maintaining open green space that, and oftentimes in our residential districts, is how we relate to that existing character of the place, and then also how we might influence stormwater runoff impacts in an area. So as David mentioned, both of our areas right now are regulated the same way that most of you who live in an R2 zoning district have with your single family lots. So front yard impervious coverage with 45% maximum is how we kind of maintain that open character of the front yards along streets. And then a total maximum coverage of 55%. For the college and university uses, there's an additional regulation that limits building footprints to 1/3 of the site area. In the proposed overlay regulations, looking at how the uses will function and operate and the type of physical development that would be necessary to support the primary uses, we've modified the lot coverage regulation slightly. So with Big Bend, there's going to be needs for lots of large open areas that will have athletic fields of varying types with varying coverage. And then a secondary aspect would be the buildings that support some of those indoor athletic related uses. So here we have a maximum lot coverage of 40%, and the goal is to reinforce and maintain any area that is not necessary for athletic fields or buildings to really be in a natural state with open spaces, trees, and landscape. Proposed for the South 40 overlay, there's more of a need for buildings, for drives, sidewalks, etc., to support the type of use and function for the South 40. And so the overall coverage there is increased to 60% under the draft regulations. Again, with South 40 having a more direct connection to building footprints, we are proposing to maintain the existing regulation that limits those building footprints to occupying 1/3 of the site. And the result of this kind of goes back to what David was talking about with housing density, of how to expect the form, the size of buildings when you limit the footprint. And in both instances, we've heard a lot from the community of a desire to really control the stormwater and those impacts that it might have when it with the adjacent communities. And so limiting the requirement that they maintain or do not increase the amount of stormwater that runs off of the site. Building heights. Currently, the limit is 2 stories or 30 feet. But under that conditional use of the college and universities, they can increase their building height to 110 feet when they have an increased setback from a property line. So what this results in is varying building heights would have varying setbacks from a property line. And another part that we want to really reinforce through our physical development of the site is maintaining a really consistent buffering or separation along the edges of both of the overlay districts. And so what we've done instead is proposed a clear height that is not directly tied to setbacks, aside from one on the Big Bend that I'll get into later. So 6 stories or 72 feet is the proposed height in Big Bend, and 6 stories or 90 feet in South 40. The only difference being what the potential average floor height would be is how you get 72 or 90. So an average of about 12 feet of floor height for 6 stories in Big Bend, or up to 15 for the 90 feet in South 40. Site access is a big one that's been discussed a lot with the community. So on the right, this map or figure was presented by Washington University during the initial community meetings back in June of 23. And this identifies the plan they or the conceptual vision they have for how bicycles, pedestrians, and vehicles will circulate within the two different areas, but then also between their three campuses. So right now, there's some existing connections for pedestrians, bicycles, and vehicles with South 40, and then there'll be new ones with Big Bend. Our current regulations with a conditional use permit, some of the criteria for review is very general language about having appropriate circulation that provides safe access for bicycles, pedestrians, and vehicles, but it is not really prescriptive in that it directs somebody into where those points of access should be. So hearing the community's response to some of the initial presentations, we wanted to build in hard code regulations to reinforce some of the conceptual aspects that have been discussed for both of the sites. So looking at the South 40, the primary access points, those are the required ones. This is where we're saying you should design the site with these in mind to be able to provide, again, that safe, efficient connections for the site to function. So these are the required ones. The secondary access points are not required, but they're allowed because they might provide necessary or desired connections for kind of the passive entrances and exits of the site, but are not necessary for the daily operations. Emergency access points are ones that may be necessary for those one-off circumstances to provide safe access to the site, but again, would not be used on a day-to-day basis. And then the prohibited site access points are ones where we really want to protect some existing separation between some of our single family neighborhoods and the existing overlay boundaries. So with South 40, we have some existing conditions to work off of. We know how the site currently functions and operates, and then we have some historic context with what has been allowed through various conditional use permits over the years. So we're proposing to restrict Forsyth to one vehicle access point. Again, that helps that existing flow of traffic along Forsyth, and then also reinforce a requirement for bicycle and pedestrian connections for the Danforth campus to flow into South 40 and vice versa. Our secondary, so again, these are not our required. One more in the primary, sorry. So the access that this proposed circulation conceptually from the Danforth campus is to draw students, faculty, and others from the campus through South 40 and down towards the proposed Big Bend overlay district. So a new required point that you would not see today would be that bicycle and pedestrian connection located near the intersection of Big Bend and Wydown in order to really draw people through the campus as it's been conceptually proposed. With Big Bend, so here we do not have that the existing conditions, so to speak, to see how people function. But what we do have is the results of the traffic study for the vehicle access points, which David will go into later. And then we also have the conceptual proposal of really trying to focus on the bicycle and pedestrian connections to make that a desired first choice for people to get to the site. So the primary access points would be along Big Bend Boulevard, and we would require vehicle, pedestrian, and bicycle access points here. Secondary would be not required, but would be allowed under this. So if both of the institutions, Concordia and WashU, desire to have vehicle connections between their two campuses, that would be allowed, but is not required. And then again, to support kind of the overall flow that we've heard from the community, we would allow the bicycle and pedestrian connections from any point along the boundary of the South or the Big Bend overlay. Emergencies, continuing to support if it's needed. There's an existing emergency access point right now that goes along the southern boundary, and that could be maintained if it was needed in the future. And then again, to protect some of our neighborhoods to make sure that they're not, they don't become kind of the cut through access points, would be restricting, prohibiting via access from the northern boundary from Dartford. So transition zones, these are a new concept that is not really currently in our code, but we're proposing within the overlay district. Transition zones are landscape buffers between the boundary of these proposed overlays and adjacent uses. Transition zones are similar to setbacks in that they wouldn't allow buildings and parking lots or garages to be there, but they're a little bit different in that they're, again, prescriptive for what we want within the transition zone. So instead of just saying what cannot be there, we are requiring them to establish some landscaping, could be a combination with fences or walls, but primarily to establish and protect some of the mature tree growth areas and the natural environment that you get. So depending on where the transition zone is, there's a transparency requirement. In some instances, we want there to be some screening year round that would, again, help separate the noise, the sites of uses. But then in other areas, we really just want to support that buffering, that separation through the natural shade landscape environment. The proposed transition zones are here outlined on a map. They're highlighted in the shaded green color. So on the South 40 overlay, we're proposing a 30-foot transition zone requirement along Wydown Boulevard. And then should the homes here that face University in Skinker Heights no longer be under common ownership with the South 40 campus, then a transition zone would be required to be established along the eastern boundary. A little bit different with the Big Bend overlay. There are significantly deeper pockets of existing mature trees that we really want to protect and, again, enhance. So the proposed transition zones are deeper here. Big Bend, for example, is 100 feet transition zone required here. For the southern portion along Tuscany and High Point, there's an 80-foot buffer requirement. And so this is an example of where there's a pretty established mature buffer of tree growth along Tuscany, but they would need to kind of expand that where it backs up to High Point. And then again, up along our other residential area with Hillcrest, there'd be a 90-foot requirement for a transition zone there. So setbacks and transition zones kind of work hand in hand. Setbacks are the requirements for building placement within a site. The way that we have outlined it is transition zones will supersede the setback requirements. Here is outlined what our current regulations do. So the same regulations are on single family lots, which are significantly smaller in size, are currently applied to our college and universities. So right now, Big Bend would be considered the front yard for this campus, which is a 60-foot required setback. The north and south property lines or district boundaries are considered side yards. So there's only a 15-foot requirement for building setback. And then the eastern boundary splitting Concordia and WashU is where there would be a rear yard. So we're proposing significantly larger setbacks. So as I mentioned with building heights, instead of having the setback be a direct relationship to the height, with one exception, we are trying to create some consistency in the overall box that they're building within, where we have these setback requirements. Another element we're able to do within the proposed overlay is introduce setback requirements for some of the physical improvements on the site that currently are not subject to site setbacks in our code, such as surface parking lots, athletic fields, and lighting, etc. So proposed along the western boundary, we want to line up our setback requirement with our transition zone being 100 feet. Along the southern boundary, we're doing the same thing. We're lining up our setback with our transition zone requirement at 80. And both of those, the building and the parking, would be subject to the same setback. Along the northern boundary, there is a varying setback. So adjacent to the existing Fontbonne University campus, the setback is 10 feet for building and 5 feet for surface parking. But as we get towards that, again, that protected transition zone, that supersedes the setbacks in that along the northern boundary. So we have the 90 feet. Along the eastern side, adjacent to Concordia, there is a step back required depending on the building height. So buildings that are 35 feet or less can be up to 10 feet from the property line. But then as you get higher than that, towards the maximum building height of 72, that would be set back 50 feet. So that creates a similarity, a cohesion between what's happening on either side of that boundary line with how Concordia will develop their new housing and how this campus, athletic campus, could be developed. Surface athletic fields are allowed to go up to 5 feet from a property line, except where a greater transition zone is required. So again, you can see that in some areas, those areas highlighted in green, it will be a very consistent setback from our adjacent neighborhoods. For the South 40, the setbacks right now are really established based on what we can see currently developed on the site, and then again, those minimums. So along Forsyth, we have a 60-foot setback, similar along Big Bend. Down, the buildings are currently 50 feet away, and then we have that same 50-foot requirement along the eastern boundary. Proposed. A big part of what we're trying to do is reinforce in the regulations some of the conceptual ideas that were presented by Washington University earlier in 2023. So shifting kind of the central intensity of this use north towards the Danforth campus is the opportunity that's created when the housing is replacing those athletic fields. And so with the setbacks, we want to again reinforce that idea. So reducing the setback along Forsyth to 40 will allow buildings to move closer to the Danforth campus, but will still provide and maintain that setback for kind of the front yard character that you see up and down Forsyth Boulevard, both east and west of this property. Similarly, along the southern boundary, along Down, we're increasing that setback requirement from the existing 50-foot to 60 feet. You can see on the diagram here, one difference with the from the Big Bend is that our transition zone requirement is only about half of that front yard setback requirement on Down instead of the entire thing. The reason for this is, again, the transition zones are kind of prescriptive, and we're saying that they need to do certain planting elements and maintain that kind of planted natural character in that buffer zone. We want to focus that along Down to really improve the experience of pedestrians, bicyclists, other people that are going up and down Down. But the remaining 30 feet of the front yard setback is still protected from the buildings encroaching in that area, but it allows some flexibility of design. It could be treated the same way as the transition zone. It could be more open lawn area for some passive uses within the campus. And then 50 feet along Big Bend side and 40 feet here along that eastern. Tree regulations. So again, this is something that we heard over and over during our engagement and feedback from the community is protecting the existing tree canopy. So both the South 40 and the proposed Big Bend area have a lot of existing mature trees. The difference being there's lots of depth of that along Big Bend in the proposed Big Bend overlay compared to the more narrow existing tree canopy coverage that you see on South 40. Currently, our regulations for both of these properties would fall under a caliper inch replacement requirement. So if they tore down a tree associated with a development project, then they would need to replace that number of caliper inches, usually resulting in maybe one larger 12 caliper inch tree being removed, and then we would see planting of multiple 3 caliper inch trees. We also currently have requirements for native percentage of trees and then also mixture of species. With Big Bend and South 40, the biggest change here is that we're proposing shifting from a caliper inch replacement to a canopy coverage. And we're doing that for a few reasons. One, we really want to reinforce the overall goal of maintaining a canopy coverage within the site. So looking at the canopy coverage, instead of just planting trees to say we replace the caliper, we really want to maintain the shade, the habitat, the stormwater that is handled with these mature trees. And so by maintaining an overall canopy coverage over time and not tying it to replacement of trees associated with specific development, it will require more intentional planning of how they continue to plant trees over time. So as a large one maybe needs to be removed or is in poor health, there's already multiple trees that are nearing maturity to take their place. So within Big Bend, like we mentioned before with lot coverage, there's going to be a need for large areas of unobstructed trees. So we're going to have fields and no trees obviously located in the middle of those. That means that a lot of our canopy coverage provided in this overlay area is going to come in those transition zones and is going to come in some concentrated areas of the site. And so working with our the city's contracted landscape architect, we determined that 20% is a good goal that will allow, again, for trees to reach maturity in some of those more densely planted areas and also provide an existing canopy coverage that is similar to what we're seeing in a lot of areas. South 40 here, because there's more flexibility in terms of how plants or how trees can be planted across the site and how they can be concentrated in different areas to provide that canopy coverage. The minimum requirement of 25 is slightly higher. Thinking about Big Bend, and we mentioned this a little bit, talking about those transition zones, there are a lot of areas that we heard is a big priority from the community to protect where these existing trees are maintained. And so what we have proposed additionally is establishing some tree growth areas. So this will be identified via a figure in our code. Highlighted in the darker green outlined here are what we are calling established tree growth areas. So these are areas of the property that have large concentrations of mature trees that we want to add additional protections. So instead of a transition zone requirement being the minimum that says we want you to have some planting areas, we've highlighted a few places where we're saying we really, there needs to be extreme circumstances that would allow any sort of tree removal, grading, or construction activities. So these are really protected areas that should not be touched as the site is developed over time. And there are also areas where we're intentionally trying to maintain that supplement and replenishment. So planning for the future of maintaining these as the concentrations of trees. So you can see in the map that we've tried to highlight areas that again provide that existing buffer from some of our single family neighborhoods as the focus of these established growth areas. The reason that the shape is not rectangular is because we also recognize through a basic conceptual review of the site that there's going to be some changes necessary to support the transition of the use from the existing conditions to the proposed athletic fields. So knowing that there will be changes to the right-of-way width along Big Bend, there's going to need to be some regrading and shifting of lanes here to support the traffic analysis that would result in some encroachment into that existing tree area. And so we want to choose an appropriate boundary. Also with some of the topography and other aspects of the site, such as where there are existing infrastructure, sewer lines, where there are buildings and roads that are going to be demolished as we transition to the new use. We really wanted to choose areas that we feel can and should be protected. Parking and loading is another one. So as David mentioned earlier, we heard from neighbors they don't want parking and traffic to go through their neighborhoods. So we've had some preliminary discussions with the city's traffic and parking engineer about the proposed uses and how to best park for this site. We've heard from the residents in the community that we do not want to underpark the site, which would result in people parking in our neighborhoods and cutting through, walking through them to get to the site. But we also don't want to overpark it. We don't want to require large areas of parking surface to be constructed on the site when it's not necessary to support the use. And so in order to find this kind of sweet spot of parking requirements, we're going to use parking studies as phases are developed. So this is a little bit of a phase over time as we understand the uses of the building and the exact sizes of those and some of the athletic fields, or on South 40 as the new buildings are built and what the use of each building is. Then we can more appropriately determine the amount of parking that's needed over time. In addition to that, we will require loading spaces for some of those food preparation or other uses that might have large amount of delivery requirements. So additional standards. Now we're going to get into some more of those big items that we heard a lot from the community, such as we don't want to see it or hear it. So lighting. Currently, the city has outdoor lighting standards that cover a variety of uses. The standards might include lighting for architectural lighting on the building, all the way through to recreational lighting. Um, but what we've heard from the community is that we really need to refine a lot of the lighting standards based on the proposed uses for Big Bend, um, to address more of our neighborhood concerns. Dark Sky International is a program that focuses on establishing principles for good lighting practices in order to light what you need in the appropriate way, but not lighting anything else. So a lot of their principles get at how do we focus the lighting, how do we use the right type of lighting, the right lighting fixtures to provide that light without impacting the overall environment, and again trying to mitigate those kind of natural impacts. So, Dark Sky has developed a specific certification program for outdoor recreational fields. This program includes review by lighting professionals that they have of plans before before they are installed, and then also inspections on the back end to make sure that everything was actually constructed to the plans. And so we're going to require that they go through this process for their outdoor recreational facilities to actually get the lighting certification. This will provide another layer of really specific knowledge that is provided through Dark Sky that is above and beyond what most of our review capacity and inspection capacity here at the city is right now. Another aspect is adding some time limits. So our current outdoor lighting really talks about lighting being turned off a certain amount of time after a game is complete. And so instead, we want to again create these perimeters, create these clear expectations so that we know and the residents know and the university knows what needs to happen operationally on the site. So we're proposing 7 a.m., which is an existing time where you're allowed to start construction and other noise currently within our code, and that lights would need to be shut off at 10:30. Another element that is slightly revised from some of our existing outdoor lighting standards is establishing a 0.5 foot candle requirement at property lines. And this is equivalent to a full moon in terms of brightness. And the big one here is that it's going to require, and also being reinforced by many of the dark sky requirements for their certification program, that we have the lights really directed towards what they're intended to light, and also using different tools, cutoffs, shields, to keep that spill or the glare of those lights away from the adjacent uses. We are establishing a maximum height of lighting, and this is important. We need to allow the light poles for the fields to go taller because that will allow us to redirect the light straight down, which limits the spill impact of them outside of the property. But we also want to maintain some expectations of what is too tall. And then for parking lot and roadway lighting, and this is able to be much shorter because it is intended to focus on a much smaller area. With South 40 lighting, we're going to use the dark sky principles here as guidelines. So there is not the same certification program that we can target the way that the uses are being developed with South 40. So instead, we'll just use them as principles. With our existing outdoor lighting regulations, a lot more of that translates directly to the type of development that South 40 will have. Again, this is going to use a lot more focus on the buildings to support the uses of South 40. And so a lot of our existing regulations will continue to apply to this site. And one thing that we have done for consistency is again repeat that time of when lights are going to be on. As David mentioned, there is going to be a number of years for all this development to occur, and so the existing fields that are on the South 40 campus will still be there for some time. So using the same regulations for them moving forward. So noise, here's another big one that we heard from the community that is a concern potentially with the proposed uses. Right now, our code allows outdoor games and music from 8 a.m. until midnight. And other than that, we really rely on St. Louis County in terms of what the lighting standard or the noise standards are and enforcement of those noise standards. So we're proposing some really specific regulations for noise given the uses that are proposed for these areas. So a big one here is, again, similar to with lighting, adding that time, the same time period. So outdoor games and music now would be 7 a.m. to 10:30. Another new element is requiring primary and secondary speaker systems. These will need to be identified when the permits for approval of a field are submitted to the city. This is really important for how the use is once we establish the physical development of the athletic field. Now we need to tie it a little bit back to the uses. So the primary system would be identified, and this is for use when there is a game where there's public participating or watching this activity. Where the secondary speaker system is something that should be significantly less noise, less speakers, can be more honed towards just maybe a team practicing on a field. And so there should be a really large separate distinction of when those two speaker systems are used and then what the capacity or the noise level associated with them is. Another element that we're proposing is actually limiting the decibels. So capping sound levels at 80 decibels, which is similar to a vacuum cleaner or a shouted conversation. There's also the chance for really steady, repetitive noises, and those are capped at 70 decibels, which is a normal conversation or a washing machine. And an important thing to just reiterate or connect back to with noise and lighting is these regulations are also kind of grouped within those setbacks, within those transition zone requirements and other elements to work together to, again, really protect what is the existing situation along property lines, what are our neighborhoods used to at the edges of these campus, and how can we best maintain that existing condition given the change of use and operation inside of the boundary. Sustainability, I think, is a growing focus for our community. We've heard a lot through this process. We've heard a lot about sustainability as well through the city's comprehensive planning process that's going on right now. So another opportunity with the overlay district is to add in some criteria, some standards, reiterate some focus areas that the city has so that the institutions and their design team really knows what is important to us. And so adding in some additional sustainability focuses for them moving forward. Now, these are not necessarily strict. They're not all strict requirements. Some of them are more guidelines in how they should approach their design. So it includes meeting LEED Silver or higher or equivalent standards, focusing and really trying to figure out how to utilize some renewable energy sources, wind and power. So again, these might shift depending on what they're actually constructing between the two sites. And then those best management practices, again, regrading, stormwater management, these are all important aspects of how the site currently functions and how can we make it better with development as that occurs over time. And then reinforcing some native species. So for perennial plantings, we'll require natives, and then we'll really stress and prioritize that for perennial or for annual plantings as well. The plan review process right now is another one that we want to address in the overlay district. So many of our existing requirements for site plan review, and that would go before the plan commission for approval, are similar to what you see on the screen today. So it's really based on the size of the building or the size of the field or any sort of regrading. And this when it would be required for plan commission. So that would be a public meeting. Right now, a lot of our architecture review board is based on single family residential requirements. And so we wanted to align architecture review requirements with site plan review, but then also address the scale at which we're developing. So as David mentioned, an overall goal of these overlays is to create the expectations of what this box is, what we're comfortable with, the overall boxes, and then how they develop inside of that box ideally would not really impact the community much because we've created that overall restriction for them. So architecture review board approval would be tied to 5,000 square feet or more, which is more similar to the scale of development that's likely to occur given the uses proposed. Another element that is also highlighted within the draft overlay. We've identified some specific site and architectural standards for each of the districts that more specifically apply to the proposed institutional uses for each campus. Whereas right now, architectural guidelines really focus on, again, single family development. So the type of materials, the design style, et cetera, for an athletic focused campus or an institution and dorm focused campus will be slightly different. And now I will turn it back to David to go over the traffic assessment.
Right. And so now we'll talk about the Big Bend Boulevard traffic assessment. And we heard a lot about traffic and a lot of concerns about what would happen if this project were to go in to the traffic on Big Bend. So the city engaged CBB, transportation and engineers to perform a traffic assessment. And the city's utilized them multiple times. They studied a lot of different projects for us in the past, and we engaged them again for this one. So at the beginning of this study, they gathered new traffic counts on Big Bend Boulevard and also looked at some key turning movements. These counts were all taken with school in session and during peak hours as well to determine exactly what the traffic levels are at the present day. So we gathered turning movement data at the intersections of Big Bend and Southmore, Big Bend and Oak Knoll Park, at Wydown Boulevard, and also at Clayton Road for this analysis. They looked at the traffic demand for the conceptual athletic uses proposed by Washington University, and then made recommendations to mitigate any impacts that those uses would have. St. Louis County did review the document. They agree with the findings within the document, and they've given an approval to that initial assessment. Now, any improvements to Big Bend Boulevard are going to require formal approval by St. Louis County, and we will need to submit more detailed information when the specific uses and the trips generated by those uses are known. But for now, the findings of the analysis were as follows. First, a traffic signal at the entrance to the site is not warranted during normal conditions, but it would be necessary or warranted for safe and efficient egress after events. So what that means is, on a day-to-day basis, a traffic signal wouldn't need to be utilized in order to get traffic and cars in and out of the Big Bend site. However, if they have an event, there are concerns that they wouldn't be able to safely filter cars out of the site absent that signal. So you could picture, say there's 200 cars that are trying to leave an event at the site at the same time. If there's no signal to stop the traffic on Big Bend, you would have 200 cars trying to make left turns out of the site, potentially, trying to find gaps, and the backup would be to the point where cars wouldn't efficiently exit, and it would take us a significant amount of time. So that needs to be controlled with a traffic signal, and that traffic signal alignment would be at Oak Knoll Park. So the entrance to the Big Bend overlay site, the WashU athletic campus, would be aligned with Oak Knoll. That would be a signalized intersection. And one of the reasons that the city and county really like this is it creates a safe pedestrian crossing on Big Bend that's between Wydown Boulevard and Clayton Road. Currently, we do not have a safe way to get pedestrians across if you're on the east side of the street to Oak Knoll Park. So this would provide that particular path. The other nice thing about it is, if you remember the WashU presentation or you've reviewed those documents from the summer, they talked about new bike and pedestrian facilities that would be on their site adjacent to Big Bend, running essentially from the South 40 southward to the entrance of the site. We could then safely get those pedestrians and cyclists across the street at this signal, and then perhaps build a nice wider path on the Oak Knoll side of the street going south all the way to Clayton Road. So those pedestrians traversing Big Bend and going south and intending to go to Clayton Road would have a safer route than the current narrow sidewalk that's along this site and Tuscany. There is a proposed left turn lane into Oak Knoll Park and a center turn lane between Oak Knoll Park and Southmore Drive South. And I'll show that diagram in a moment and highlight some of those benefits. And the analysis also showed that these proposed changes would not have any negative impact on the traffic progression on Big Bend Boulevard under typical conditions. meaning the amount of time it takes you to get from Clayton Road to Forsyth or to points beyond would not be negatively impacted by any of these improvements. So you can see the 4-lane section that currently exists. These are the existing conditions. This is the Big Bend overlay site where the athletic campus would be. You can see that there is no current entrance to that site off of Big Bend. Here's that entrance to Oak Knoll Park, and here's Southmore Drive South. This proposed line drawing here shows, and this is very conceptual, what these traffic improvements may look like. So you can see the widening of Big Bend all takes place on the Washington University side of the road. So no additional land would be needed on the west side of the street. And you can see that there's a left turn lane that would then be installed. And this is where the signalized intersection would be for cars that are traveling north and wish to go into Oak Knoll Park. You would have a dedicated left turn lane there. And then there's a new center turn lane that would be between the Oak Knoll Park entrance and Southmore Drive South. So this serves two functions, and something we're really excited about is for residents wanting to get into Southmore Drive South, they can actually pull into this center turn lane and not impede any traffic behind them while they wait for an opening from the southbound cars to make that left turn movement. So again, it's a protected left turn for the Southmore residents looking to turn into their neighborhood. So it doesn't back up the traffic on Big Bend, which occurs at peak hours in some instances today. That center turn lane would also act as a left turn lane for cars traveling south going into this particular site. And you can see there's a considerable amount of distance here. So you can stack cars if you have an event or something else that shouldn't hold up any kind of traffic on Big Bend as they turn left into the site. So these are the proposed improvements through the plan. And I do want to stress that the city and county would not be paying for these improvements. This would be paid for by Washington University, all of these improvements here, being that they're necessitated by the development itself. And so the next steps in this process, we're going to continue to gather community input. We had the public meeting earlier this week. We're also going to schedule neighborhood level meetings. So look for those emails to come out. Those will be smaller discussions because every neighborhood has concerns that are a little bit different. So we want to make sure that we sit down and address all of those with each of those neighborhoods. And then concurrent with our meetings, Washington University will hold their own set of meetings with neighborhoods separate from ours to address any items that residents might want to talk about with them. So look for those invites. That's the next step in this particular process. We will, in addition to uploading this presentation, the presentation slides, we will upload the overlay regulations themselves and the traffic assessment. And you can find all of that in engageclayton.com. Engageclayton.com also offers you the opportunity to leave comments on that particular website, and we will gather information there as well. Once we receive all of that information, we will continue to finalize the overlay district regulations and fine tune those. When we feel those are prepared and ready, they would move on through to the formal approval process. That starts at the Plan Commission. There would be a public hearing, and they would ultimately make a recommendation to the Board of Aldermen, where the Board of Aldermen could consider establishing the overlay district regulations within our municipal code. So we would codify all of these standards. The next step, and we would actually do these at the same time, would be a hearing at the Plan Commission and at the Board of Aldermen to apply these overlay districts to the actual sites. So that requires a change to the city's zoning map. And so again, it would be public hearings throughout that process, with the Plan Commission making a recommendation to the Board of Aldermen, who would ultimately need to approve an ordinance to put these changes in place. And as these things are going on with the overlays, Concordia Seminary would seek conditional use approval for their student housing. They will do that through the standard conditional use permit process. That does require public hearings. And that, again, that process would happen concurrently. So there's essentially 3 applications that would be considered at the same time: the Concordia CUP, the changes to the city's municipal code to add the overlays as a regulatory framework, and then finally the application of those overlays to the actual site. So those are the next steps in the process, but we are still at step 1 here, which is gathering that community input. So we look forward to hearing any questions or comments that the community may have at this point, and we'll work hard to address those over the coming weeks. Thank you all very much. So when a developer applies for a project or for a particular portion of a project,